Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Scott Taylor. I'm the still relatively new dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies. It's a real pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. It's great to see you in this lovely venue. Today I think we have a real treat in store for us, a fascinating conversation. Diplomacy is an enormously complex enterprise, spanning so many different areas: crisis management, international security, conflict resolution, development, much of which takes place behind closed doors. And in the Pardee School, we take the study of diplomacy quite seriously. In fact, the bulk of our professors of the practice are esteemed professors of the practice are former diplomats themselves, namely Ambassador Paul Hare, Vesko Garcevic, Ambassador Mark Starella, Ambassador Jorge Heine, who's here, and Mark Starella, who's here. We teach diplomacy because it is foundational to the study and understanding of international relations. And our outstanding professors inspire our students not only to learn, but to consider diplomatic careers themselves, at least I hope they do. Our distinguished guest today has a uniquely illuminating first-hand perspective on some of the most vexing and critically important diplomatic issues of our time. From geographic areas as diverse as Brussels, to Libya, to Haiti, to Iran, to Japan, to Ukraine, and beyond. And we are honored to welcome Baroness Cathy Ashton to Boston University and to the Pardee School. Lady Ashton will speak on her many years as a diplomat, and especially on her new book, which I hope many of you have had a chance to grab, although don't peruse it until our proceedings are concluded. And we have copies over here at the table. But she'll speak on her new book, And Then What? Inside Stories of 21st Century Diplomacy. And in the book, which I've had a chance to read, she weaves in a dramatic and absorbing story of her witness to and engagement in, as I said, some of the most compelling political developments of the early 21st century. So I do hope you'll have a chance to, Vesko, I'm sorry, Vesko, I didn't see you back there. Ambassador Garcevic is also here. I hope you'll have an opportunity to take a look at the book and to read it and to learn from it. There's a lot of valuable knowledge, not just for students, but for all of us, indeed. But before introducing Baroness Ashton, I want to thank my colleagues, Elizabeth Emrine, who's here, the Assistant Director of our Center for the Study of Europe, for her efforts in putting this event together, and also my colleague, Tina Carter de la Cruz, in the back, our Strategic Initiatives Manager, for working so well to bring us all together. And organize this event. I also want to acknowledge our colleagues from the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars and our partners in this event who accompanied Baroness Ashton, Isabel Shriver and Robin Quinville. Ms. Shriver is the Development Associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and increasingly an important partner of ours. And Robin Quinville is the recently named director of the Center's Global Europe Program. She spent 3 decades as a U.S. diplomat with numerous European postings, including DCM and Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. Thank you both for being with us this afternoon. In addition, I want to thank Ken Slater and the Slater family. Although Ken could not be with us today, some of you may know Ken Slater is a member of the University Board of Trustees here at BU. He's also a member of the Dean's Advisory Board for the Pardee School, he and his family have generously supported both the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Pardee School, through the Woodrow Wilson Center through the Slater Family Distinguished Fellows, of whom Baroness Ashton is currently one of that number, and he's helped to make this partnership with the Woodrow Wilson Center possible. So I want to thank Ken Slater and the Slater family for that. The Right Honourable Baroness Cathy Ashton is a former British Labour politician, a government minister, and diplomat. Lady Ashton joined the UK's Department of Constitutional Affairs and Justice in 2004 as minister with responsibilities for family courts, development of the Supreme Court, human rights, and equality legislation. From 2007-2008, she served as leader of the House of Lords and Lord President of the Queen's Privy Council in Prime Minister Gordon Brown's first cabinet. During that time, she ushered in the Lisbon Treaty through the House of Lords, the Lisbon Treaty, which may come up in discussion. It's a foundational piece of governance legislation in the European Union. And in 2008, Lady Ashton was appointed Trade Commissioner for the European Commission, the first woman to hold that role, and the first woman British European Commissioner. From 2009 to 2014, she served as the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And over this period, she tackled, as I mentioned, some of the world's most difficult issues, including leading the P5+1 talks on Iran's nuclear program, the Iran deal, as we know it in the United States, and galvanizing agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, operating on the very highest level and earning widespread praise as a negotiator and as a leader. She has been recognized with a host of awards and honors from around the globe, including being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She's a life peer of the British House of Lords and holds honorary positions with a number of esteemed international institutions. No stranger to higher ed, she has taught at Yale and taught-ish at University of Pennsylvania, and served as Chancellor of Warwick University in the United Kingdom. And as I mentioned, she is currently the Slater Family Distinguished Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Baroness Ashton will offer some reflections on her extraordinary career in diplomacy, followed by a conversation moderated by my distinguished colleague, Professor Kaija Schilde. As many of you know, Professor Schilde is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Security and Director of our Center for the Study of Europe. After they've engaged in a bit of discussion and question and answer, we will open it to the wider audience, and we'll have a book signing as well as a small reception following the proceedings. Lady Cathy Ashton, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We're honored by your visit. We look forward to your remarks, and welcome to Boston.
Wonderful. I can. Sorry. So, as Dean Taylor said, my name is Kaija Schilde, and I had a chance to read Baroness Ashton's book. And so I just wanted to kick things off by asking her a few questions. She's an incredibly important person in my life. I don't know if she knows that, but I'm about to share that briefly in my questions and comments. But I wanted to let everyone know that even though you haven't read the book, I'm going to hint at a few of the things that are going on in it. Baroness Ashton is going to discuss some of the themes. I'm going to try to lead her through some of the greatest hits, essentially, of what is in the book. And I want you to be thinking about your questions, because immediately I'm more interested in the questions you have and her answers to you than I am in the kinds of conversations I'm having with her right now, even though I am deeply interested in her responses. So, what I wanted to say first is that I did read this book. I have it in my lap, and I have it in my lap because I was going to actually read from the last page of it, the last and first quote. But I wanted to express first just what a large presence you have been in my life as a personal thing, because this book is so personal. So I wanted to insert myself in this briefly. So I am a scholar of the European Union foreign and security policy, the defense policy of the European Union. And so if there is anybody in my life who has been central to that as a figure, as somebody I've watched your career, and in the book, you discussed at the beginning what an unlikely career it was, that you did not have the background in this. Nobody had a background in European Union foreign and security policy, because Baroness Ashton was placed in the inaugural role. But I wanted to center myself briefly and then turn it over to hearing about all this. I'm a professor at Boston University of European Union foreign and security policy. I interviewed for this job on December 1st, 2009. So we started at the same time, me as a little baby assistant professor studying the topic, and you actually practicing this. And so the things that I'm going to ask her about, that I encourage you to think about too, is the centrality and this importance of the EU as a global actor. The EU as emerging actor in diplomacy and negotiation, in balancing great powers or coordinating them or having some power of its own and what that means. Also the role of diplomacy and negotiation in the 21st century, not just in the 21st century, but in a really critical time frame of things that are still affecting us right now. And then also just as a woman in diplomacy and negotiation, and as somebody representing a country that no longer is part of the European Union. Your Venn diagrams are about 60 things overlapping of importance and of interest to us today. So my first question that I'd just like to invite you to answer is, this book is as current as anything could possibly be. All of the events, all the people, all the leaders, all the stories, all the crises, all the revolutions are still affecting us in 2023. And so I wanted to ask to what degree that was on your mind as you sat down to write this. You wrote this book today. You didn't write it 10 years from now. You're still young. You could write something 20 years from now. What about 2022 or 2023 was on your mind right now about what is important in this world and what we need to think about?
Well, first of all, thank you. And it's great to have somebody who's kind of grown up with me in this role. And we thought we would do a conversation because the most important part of tonight for me is when you get to talk and ask me things or to make comments about what we've been talking about. Get rid of the Baroness bit. My name is Cathy. Everybody calls me Cathy. Please call me Cathy. I do not want to hear Baroness. I shall get very stroppy. So that's the first thing and only thing that's instruction today. But the book, as you will read, is based on a series of tape recordings that my husband did when I would come back from some of the travels I undertook as the EU's High Representative. And they particularly focus on some areas that were going through dramatic change. So you'll see the Arab Spring, you'll see the earthquakes in Haiti and Japan, you'll see the Iran talks and the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, and of course Ukraine. And I tried to capture them by talking about what it was really like to be in the room. This is not a book written for foreign policy experts. We've got plenty of those. It's written, I hope, for you, people who are interested and who would like to know what it really is like to be in the room and to be part of the conversation and the real things that people are thinking about, whether it's wearing the right shoes or my need for a glass of white wine. It will all be there. And I've changed nothing. I've not tried to be clever and give you the up-to-date version or tell you things that I know now but didn't know then. So you'll have to forgive that sometimes you'll think, she should have known that, because then I didn't. But your question specifically is why now? And it was because as I transcribed the tapes and started to think about what had happened, I was surprised by how much I had forgotten and the detail and the conversations and the reasons we were able to achieve things or not. And I was very conscious that as I looked around the world and I looked at the stories I was creating, that none of them had been resolved. No. Either because they were still ongoing or because we had failed to look after the fragile peace or the fragile agreements we had completed. And there's lots of lessons for me in that, but hopefully some lessons is a big word. It's more messages about how we need to approach the questions that we face in terms of foreign policy, diplomacy, or crisis. And just one tiny example of that is, why is it that we think problems that have taken decades to bubble up and explode can be resolved in 6 months or a year? Why do we think one generation of girls going to school in a country is going to transform hundreds of years of girls and women being seen to be, well, to have disappeared or vanished away from the communities? Why do we think that we can resolve problems quickly and move on, when actually it is both the drip of diplomacy and the longevity of our commitment that will make the difference?
So the chapters in the book are organized essentially by events. The chapters are along the lines of natural disasters, Haiti and Japan in 2011, Haiti in 2010, correct, and Japan in 2011, and then the Arab Spring, the Egypt chapter on the Arab Spring, the Libya aftermath of the Arab Spring. You have the Ukrainian Revolution. You have the Iran deal negotiation. And so that was just weighing on me when I read this last night. I actually got quite depressed, I have to say.
Sorry.
No, not because of your narrative, but because of exactly that, the thing you're reflecting on right now, that these major initiatives that we have reached some form of success on, a lot of them are ongoing, as you said. And that was the nature of my sadness. And not because I think the world works differently than that, but because it just was so present to me. And so I suppose natural disasters can't be fixed, but a lot of these questions are, what do you think the role of diplomacy is in building enduring solutions that can't be undone a few years later? And I'm not suggesting your work was undone, but we know the Iran deal has become undone. This was just an awe-inspiring amount of work and political skill and diplomacy that went into this, and it's been undone. That doesn't mean it can't be rebuilt, but I'm just so curious about your reflections on that.
Particularly the Iran deal. I spent 4.5 years leading the talks, more time with the Iranians than with my family in that period. So it's a bit sad when it all crumbled. Not quite to dust, but it's not in good shape, as they say. So the reflections would be, I think, a few things. The first is that sometimes we think the job is done because we've reached the point of an agreement. And arguably it's when the job begins. Because in any agreement that you reach, there will always be people who think it's the wrong agreement. There will always be opportunities for people to unravel it. There will always be events that knock it off course. There will always be the unforeseen things that you can't contemplate that make it very difficult for it to continue. And so we need to build into our diplomatic thinking, how do we not only reach agreements, but nurture them over years, possibly even decades, in order to make sure that they survive. When it comes to how we tackle crises, we have to think more deeply about what's going on. And I'll give you an example from, if I may, from what was going on in Egypt, when the wind that blew across the Arab world, that we call the Arab Spring, became a tornado almost in Egypt, with dramatic events and dramatic change. And the instinct of the people in the street was to say, okay, we've removed our leader, President Mubarak. Now what we need is an election. We've got to vote somebody in. And I started to talk to them about what I call deep democracy, which is to move beyond the election, which is the cherry on the icing on the cake, and actually create the cake, bake the cake. And that's about the underpinning of institutional framework that makes democracy work. So it's about the right to vote. It's about the ability to vote. It's about knowing the votes will get counted. It's about knowing that the judges will work properly. It's about knowing that the police force will protect you while you vote. It's about knowing who the candidates are. It's about a free press that will allow you the information that you need. It's about political parties allowed to flourish. Nobody's got a perfect democracy. But in democracies that are mature, it's underpinned by all of these things. Civil society, the right to demonstrate on the streets, the ability to make your voice heard, all of the things that, as a young man actually in Libya said to me at the end of the bombing in Benghazi, when he got out of prison after 8 years, and he said, we want what you've got. You just take democracy for granted as part of your way of life. It's with you every day. And so an element that is really important to me is building things properly with real foundations and building them deep, so that when things go wrong and things wobble about, because democracy is not a straight line, it goes all over the place. I come from a country that we talk about Magna Carta as the beginning. 1215 was when that was signed. And yet it took 700 years before people who look like me could vote. Democracy is not a straight line, it wobbles about. And that means you have to think much deeper about what it is you're trying to do when you're trying to build. And it means you need to think longer term, as I've already said, but also about what it is you're actually doing. And too often, in crises or in dramatic change, we go for the obvious. Well, let's appoint somebody, let's elect somebody, then that's okay, we've done it. When we haven't, because we haven't done the work that underpins it. So if we could do those kinds of things, and think longer, think deeper, think about implementation, think about sticking with it, think about the underpinning things we have to do, I think we have greater chance of success.
So that actually leads me to a question that I wanted to probe a little bit about the unique nature of the European Union itself in promoting democracy. I teach classes just about the European Union, about European integration, about what the EU is, what it does, what it isn't. And what's interesting is that a lot of scholars and observers have noticed that, well, promoting democracy is hard for these reasons, that it takes normally maybe 700 years or a few hundred years to consolidate. But if any actor in the world has successfully promoted democracy in the last few decades, it's the EU. And they didn't do it by force, they didn't do it by invading a country, they did it through what's called the acquis communautaire, this essentially long set of regulations that says a country can join the EU if it does X, Y, and Z, which involves upgrading almost everything about it. I make the joke that, you know, the dog catcher has to be elected differently in the town. You know, there's a regulation about it probably. I don't know if that's true, but still funny joke. Yeah. And so through this slow bureaucratic process, the EU itself has been quite exceptional at turning especially Central and Eastern European countries towards democracy. People say NATO had a role to play in that too, but that there is a special, exceptional, underlying quiet superpower to what the EU can do that states actually haven't been able to do. And so around the time of your tenure, not because of you, but there was a lot of beating up on the EU. There always is. And people are always declaring the end of the EU, talking about how weak the EU is or whatever. And a lot of the discourse, especially when the EU External Action Service was created, was what is the value added of EU foreign policy? And that was the big existential question that was sitting over your head at the beginning of your tenure. What was the value added of there being a diplomatic service and a foreign minister of the EU? And I don't know if I want to invite you to tie any of those things together. I know foreign policy isn't a session policy, but still, what was the value of the EU having a foreign policy?
I used to say to people when we were setting up our delegations across the world, when you go into an embassy from Germany or Italy or France or Slovakia or Poland or wherever, you know when you walk through the door which country you're in. And it's because of the paintings or the flags or whatever it is, you know. Countries with great pride, and the US does this extremely well, shows off that you are in the United States or you are in the UK or you're in wherever. And so my question to the ambassadors I was appointing, the heads of delegation, was, how will you know you're in Europe? What will it be? And I was trying to get them to think beyond the paintings and the rugs, important though those were, about what it was that we could add in terms of value to what individual countries could do. And that's what led me to do the Serbia-Kosovo work and the Iran deal. And the reason was that no single country could resolve those issues. No single country could have the pull of soft power to the Serbs and Kosovars and the Western Balkans that was the promise of a better future. What they wanted was to feel that they could live in peace and security. And if the EU does anything, it proves that we've finally found better ways of achieving our objectives than war. And if you want proof of that, look what's happening further east in Ukraine and Russia. But the EU, which has been very good at killing itself for a very long time, doesn't do that anymore. It argues across the table, very publicly, but it argues across the table. So these countries want to come into it for their own security and peace, and also because their economies will improve. They will be part of a huge single market. They'll have great opportunity for business and commerce. Why wouldn't they want to come in? And the pull of that means that they're able to do things that would be normally impossible to consider, to make friends with their enemies, to recognize they have to move forward because there's something they can offer their people in return for making what are very difficult decisions. That's what the EU can do for them that no individual member state can do. And it's true in many circumstances, and the Iran deal was another one, where the EU, as the chair of it, offered the soft power pull. Yes, strong economic sanctions against Iran that would be lifted, but it was about the relationships that could be established with a whole group of countries. And it's true if you look at all of the key strategic relationships the EU has. It's offering either the promise of a better future by becoming part of the EU, maybe one day, or at least getting much closer to the EU, and the capacity to resolve problems together is often copied. The Africa Union discussions and format is based on the EU. It's funded by the EU. It's set up in part with help from the EU. And it has committee structures like the EU. Countries working together in Asia, ASEAN, have begun to think about how they can strengthen and deepen the relationships they have, so they come to the EU to ask and talk about what could be done. And the Arab League, which is a complicated and complex organisation, common language, and that's about it in terms of commonality, but always looking to have these dialogues with the EU. So there's a very particular set of things that tell you you're in Europe rather than just in an individual nation.
So that makes me think about, and I fully agree, and that's exactly what I was hoping you would say, is I was hoping you would really convince everyone in the room of that value added, of diplomacy at another level of analysis, diplomacy that's getting its legitimacy from other forms other than just national power. And I think what you did with it was masterful as well, and the fact that you decided to select cases where there was opportunity for that kind of leverage shows a pretty unbelievable level of sophistication at the beginning with essentially, I mean, like I said, the reason I told everyone that I've been watching her since December 1st, 2009 is because I remember being so frustrated at the narrative, not just about what the EU could do, but about what you could do. Possibly, and there's a gendered element to that as well, which I'm going to ask her in 2 more questions. But what your answer about soft power and the leverage and the opportunities in soft power for actors who want to be in the EU orbit, like Balkan states, or by other actors who are trying to emulate the EU, like the African Union. And it's quite literal, like the emulation is direct. It's let's create something like the EU. And so I really want to disabuse anyone of the idea that the EU is a failed or weak project. There is this massive soft power, whether it's organizational, direct, leverage, et cetera. But I suppose I wanted to pivot into whether there was anyone, and I'm being intentionally cute here, whether there was anyone who might have been upset by or offended by that soft power coming out from the EU, and I'm thinking specifically of the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014. They were waving EU flags in Kyiv. They wanted an accession agreement. people on the ground might not have known exactly the details. I think there was some confusion about whether they were really going to be a potential EU member. They were not. They were going to have an agreement with freer trade, lower visa requirements, lower barriers in general. And from what I understand, that did not look like soft power to Vladimir Putin and to his regime. And I was reminded of that this week when looking at the Georgian protests. They're also waving EU flags, and it made me very anxious for Georgia. And so I'm not saying that soft power is hard power. I'm asking you from both conceptually, but also your experiences in negotiating with Vladimir Putin, the person, and speaking with him about whether or not you think his worldview accepts that soft power or is threatened by it.
I think that Vladimir Putin would be very happy if the EU went away. Mm-hmm. I think he was one of a very few people who thought that Brexit made Britain stronger, in that it took Britain away from playing a strong role within the EU. And I respect the decision that was made by my own country. But from a foreign policy point of view, it was for me a shame to see Britain move away from playing such an important and pivotal role and from working so well with its allies. So for Putin, if he could see the EU crumble, he would feel more content. And it's interesting because the original demonstrations and the original invasion by Russia is a decade ago. You know, we sort of think this is all new. It was a year ago. No, it wasn't. It wasn't at all. And I was in Kyiv just before we all went into the lockdown because of COVID, talking about what was going on in parts of the Donbass where we had small skirmishes that were creating chaos and havoc for many communities. And of course, we still had the loss of Crimea. So this is a decade old already as a conflict. And it didn't begin with the threat that Ukraine was going to join NATO, which sort of gets wheeled out every now and then. It began because they were signing a trade agreement with the EU. It was an association agreement, as you rightly said, which gave them trade relations plus the opportunity to deal with things that they were keen to tackle. And the Russians had gradually ratcheted up sanctions against Ukraine during that summer because they didn't want them to do it, because they started to fear what this would mean. So there is a strong argument that says what Russia was more concerned about then was the EU on its doorstep, democracy on its doorstep, the fear that the movement away from the relationship that it wanted with Ukraine, which was essentially that Ukraine should be subordinate in some way, to being a strong nation. I hope with a relationship with Russia at that time, we didn't want them not to have one, but a relationship based on ideas and values that led it towards the European Union. Member or not didn't matter. It wasn't about that. It was about the direction of travel for a country. And that was what they didn't want, and that's why they moved in. And everything that followed afterwards, and all of this stuff about we don't want NATO on the border and stuff, is all a consequence of that. But it began from that. And it's really significant because in looking at what we do about all this, we've not only got to resolve Ukraine, but there is Georgia. I mean, it's 2008 since they moved into Georgia. I used to get text messages that said they've moved the barbed wire half an inch or an inch and a half, because they would just move it around to try and create a bit of chaos in an area which was already showing that they'd taken away land from the country, which was a very much the way that Putin liked to behave, to make countries not quite whole, not quite able to do things as a whole nation. And then Moldova, where you have Transnistria, where the Russians are there, and you see the bubbling up of trouble. They have a pro-EU government that's in trouble, and it's in trouble because they don't want them there. So there's a lot of areas that we need to think about in terms of the values and ideals we hold, because the promotion of democracy, the freedom of human rights, the right to determine as a nation your future is something that we passionately believe in, all of us, Europeans and Americans, and from other countries across the world. And that's something we should value and hang on to, even against what Vladimir Putin is doing now?
So, I want to invite you to, I essentially want to just extract out of you a Vladimir Putin anecdote. And so I think I'll do it in this form, and that is that you write in this book that you were not a diplomat before this, and then you became the diplomat of the newest foreign service in the world, essentially, this entity. And you, in real time, designed the plane while you were flying it, essentially. And so through the course of this, you essentially got a PhD in diplomacy and negotiation. And so I just want to invite you to share some of essentially what you learned, whether it was about the individuals, the process, any of the personalities or people, or perhaps what misperception people have about negotiation and diplomacy that you learned.
So I've said this everywhere I go. The first and most important and valuable skill of a negotiator is the ability to listen. And it's not just listening to what someone's saying to you, it's what they're not saying to you. It's the nuances, it's the stuff that's going on in the way that they say the words that they say. Because unless you understand where they sit and what they see, you can understand nothing about how to get to an agreement. So when I've talked with Vladimir Putin or with his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, I will ask them what they see. And particularly, I asked Sergei Lavrov about what he saw in the Maidan demonstrations. And what he saw, and I described this in the book, is a mirror image of what I saw. It wasn't that he wasn't looking, it wasn't that he couldn't see, but he saw something entirely different. Now, we can say he's lying and that he's making it up or whatever we like, but that's what he sees. And the first thing I learned is that when you talk to people, you discover what it is they see and what their history tells them about you. So if you're talking to the Iranians, you talk about the loss of democracy in 1953, they're off. If you talk to the Serbs and Kosovars, the Battle of Kosovo of 1389 will come up in conversation at the blink of an eye, and before you know it, there's a screaming match going on. There are long histories, there are deep wounds, there are difficult scars that they want to pick at, and there are issues and ideas that come from where they sit in the world. So the most important thing I learned is you have to start from that premise. Who are they? What's important to them? How do they view the world? How do they view you? And what is it that you think you can build from that? And I suppose the second thing that I learned is you get nowhere if you can't build some level of trust. The most important part of that is not that you don't lie to them, because you'll often not give them information when you're building a negotiation. You don't lie so much as hold back. But they have to believe that when you say to them, I can't do that, it's real. And when you say to them, what you tell me in this room stays here, that you mean it. Even within the book, where I tell you quite a lot of detail, there are many things I will never tell because I never would. There are conversations, probably many of them long forgotten, that are not to be repeated. But most important of all in a negotiation in that context, it's the trust that allows people to try out ideas. What about if we did this? Or, well, if we move that here or we move that there? Things for which they don't have a mandate. They don't have anyone saying you're allowed to talk about this. They just want to explore. And that, for any negotiator, particularly in international negotiations, is really difficult to do, and dynamite if they get found out for having done it, because they've gone beyond their mandate. They've said things they shouldn't have said. They've tried out ideas that in the end might not work. So building the trust around the capacity to have those conversations is really, really important. And it's the trust in, going back to the point about listening, in knowing who it is you're talking to. Know all about them, learn all about them. You know, about their families, about who they are, where they come from, what they think. Because all of it will help you to find a way to negotiate a solution. not so much on the technical detail, but on the way you're going to do it and the way in which they might respond to you as a result.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions left. I'm warning everyone because I'm going to be looking out to you and taking your questions. And the 2 last questions really have to do with gender. And I'm asking you this question not to be a feminist killjoy or anything. I'm asking it because it's in the book. It's in the first chapter. The fact that you were getting these text messages and calls that you didn't even know you were appointed yet, and you were being, it was essentially somebody decided that it was going to be you. It's a very surreal introductory chapter. And what really jumped out to me was that it was explicit. You don't have to apply critical gender theory to this to see it. It was that somebody said, there needs to be a British center-left woman, left-of-center woman, and we need it to be this kind of person. And so you express in this introductory chapter just kind of just how disorienting that experience was. But I wanted to suggest something a little bit more academic in that moment. There's a theory called, everyone's heard of a glass ceiling, right? That women or minorities or women or non-white males, let's just say, have a hard time breaking through a glass ceiling in organizations. There's been another empirical observation that at moments of crisis or greatest challenge, whether it's a firm facing a loss of stock or a country trying to negotiate an impossible trade deal to leave a trade bloc, or electoral districts, parties nominating people for an electoral district, that often in very difficult or impossible situations, that's when women are elevated to leadership positions. It's called the glass cliff theory. And at the moment of about 2009 to 2011, I just want to re-emphasize to everyone just how negative all of the discussions about the European Union were, about its relative power, its ability in the world, and this is exactly the moment where you become the High Representative. And so I was thinking about that a lot as I was watching you. And what's interesting is you defied it all. You didn't fail. And so I don't know if you want to reflect on that feminist academic question and comment.
So the thing about getting a job that is new and that everyone is kind of interested across 27 countries, Croatia had not yet joined, and obviously the UK was still a member, is that there is a massive level of anticipation about who's going to do what. And I describe it often as, you read the book and you imagine the character in the book and what they look like. And then you see the movie and the actor doesn't look like you thought they should look like in the book. And you're really disappointed, if not angry, that they haven't got it right. Well, I felt like the character in the movie, that for many people, it was, who? Why her? And so on. And the translation of that is then into ways to try and make it obvious that it was a wrong choice anyway. And if you're a woman, there are certain ways that they get you or go for you. And it's what you wear. It's things to do with the expectation on women's lives. So somebody once wrote about me wearing my watch and it still being on British time, which is an hour different to Brussels. I hadn't noticed. It was an ordinary watch, and I never changed it because I use my phone as my clock, yeah? This is now an Apple Watch, it's different, but in those days. So I didn't even know. But they wrote it up as she can't be taking this job seriously because she's obviously thinking about home because her watch is on British time. Seriously. That they try and kind of get you that you cannot be serious in your work because you have got other pressures on you. And they do it almost as what a shame. It's a pity, isn't it? But of course you'll have to think about family and the washing or whatever that women have to do. And it's just a way, you realise after a while, of trying to knock off course something that European Union is doing by attacking you as the symbol of the European Union. And especially in the British press, which can be vicious at times, they, of course, went for that big time in lots of kind of weird and amazing ways. They would try and suggest things about me or say them. And you discover as well that journalists often don't get paid unless they get an article in the paper. I once asked a journalist why he'd printed a story that was completely untrue, because if he'd asked my office, we'd have given them the story. And he said, I wasn't going to ask you because the paper doesn't like you. So if I wrote anything nice about you, they're not going to print it and I won't get any money. Right? So you find, and this is not unique to me, but you find that you're trapped in a sort of world. So part of the reason you were kind enough to say I succeeded, part of the way to deal with it is simply to get on with doing what it is you've come to do. Because you can't defeat it except by your own success. And actually I've had a lot of apologies from journalists and newspapers since, which is very nice. But I think it's about, in any job, and you may experience this, it's often not really about you. It's about what you represent, who you are, not as a real person, but as something that they want to say is a bad idea. And they translate that into being about you personally because it's a lot easier to say, well, she's no good at this, or her office was, she didn't answer her phone after 9 p.m. at night, so she can't be serious. We did. They just hadn't left it long enough for it to switch to the next thing. But there's lots and lots of ways that that happens, and that is very common. And unfortunately for women in public life, it's not only that you get the glass cliff, that you get given the job at moment of maximum chaos, but it's also that you have to confront the fact that the default position is that you are unsuitable and you will fail. And so you have to ride over that and make sure that you succeed.
So that sets me up for my very last, it's not even a question, I just wanted to read the last few sentences of your book. And I was going to read it, but it occurred to me that I could ask you if you wanted to read it.
I'll put my specs on. Yeah.
Okay. And so it is, it feeds very nicely into the idea that not only were you the first, but you were also the last, one of the last major representatives of your country to the EU in service.
So you want to read from there?
So from there, yeah.
You ready? Story time. I want to end this book with a reflection on being the first. In my generation, many women have found themselves the first woman to hold a particular role. There is no roadmap then. Nobody to give advice or warn of potential difficulties. I was the first woman in my family to go to university. I became the first female commissioner for trade and then the first high representative. After leaving office, I became the first female chancellor of Warwick University and the first woman chancellor of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. It's not always easy to be first, but the main challenge that the first takes on is to make sure there is a second. The responsibility of ensuring that your appointment is not seen as an aberration, a case of having slipped through the net as a one-off, not to be repeated easily, if ever. Women who get to be second prove themselves just as much. They show that the first is not an exception, but rather the norm. We should celebrate their achievements more. To be the first is not so surprising, but what I'd not expected to be was the last. With the departure of the UK from the EU, the opportunity for another British person to play a role in developing European foreign policy is lost. I will be the last woman UK commissioner as well as the first. The last British High Representative as well as the first. For the first time in my life, I am the last. In its own way, it's another first.
What are we
how are we doing the microphone? Okay. Okay. Great.
So I was a little late, so if you already talked about it, you don't have to, but didn't you read it that you were the first in your family to go to college? Isn't it what it said?
I did.
And yet you're a baroness? I'm confused. Do you acquire the title of baroness through marriage, or how did it happen?
Marriage? No.
So it's, to me, it's a cognitive dissonance. I apologize.
Not at all. It is a political appointee. So I'm a baroness because I'm a member of the House of Lords, and I was put in the House of Lords by Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. And when you go into the Lords, you get this title of baroness. And you kind of get stuck with it, really. I'm also a dame, but we won't go there. I'm also a dame because I have another honour, so, you know.
Hi, so I just want to know how did the...
I can't hear you. Yeah.
Hi, Hi ma'am, yeah.
Hi.
I want to know how did the findings of Chilcot report impact UK's approach to diplomatic relations with other countries?
Well, you'd have to ask, I think, the British foreign ministers of the day about that rather than me, because I represented the European Union, not the UK. And the Chilcot inquiry, which I've read, by the way, cover to cover, was about what happened in the Iraq War and the build-up of decision-making in that. I think what I would say from talking to ministers who were both present then and have been in office since, of both parties, is that it brought out a number of issues to do with how decision-making should happen in the future, especially how to make sure that the different departments are working together. Because one of the issues that came to the forefront in the Iraq War was the aftermath. And in the book, I talk about Libya and the challenges that we had at the end of what happened in Libya when Gaddafi went, of how to try and get support into a country when you need the country to be in a good place and able to invite that support in. So there were kind of echoes of that. So I think what you'll find is that the big lessons are about decision making.
And speakers who are asking questions, please introduce yourselves.
I'm Jorge Heine. I teach at the Pardee school, and I had the privilege to actually have lunch with the Baroness. So once again, thank you for a wonderful.
You were wearing a wonderful hat then. You haven't
That's right. It's called my Leonid Brezhnev hat. Baroness, I'd like to ask you
Cathy, how many times?
I learned my lesson.
You mentioned Libya, and no doubt you had to deal with many highly complex issues, the Arab Spring being one of them. Yet there is a line of argument that if there is one case in which Western hubris led to what we have now, it's 12 years since Libya's a failed state, civil war going on in some ways, led to something that wasn't necessary. That was, some people would say, an intervention of choice. I was wondering what your reflections on that would be.
So those of you who are not so familiar, Libya got caught up in what we've described as this wind, the Arab Spring that moved across the whole region. And for those of us trying to help and support countries going through chaos, there are a number of things to remember, of which the most important is we had no idea where and how this would end. It could have been another 6-7 countries could have been caught up in it. It was very difficult to know what you were looking at. Even when you watch the TV scenes of demonstrations, it was hard to know what it was. Who was demonstrating, against whom? It's not always as clear-cut as it might appear. And in Libya, you had a situation where Benghazi, which is one particular part of Libya, had always been, for Gaddafi, who was the autocratic leader, a pain in the neck. He had made sure that this part of the country did not get the kind of support and help and development. The roads leading to Benghazi were fantastic because he wanted to be able to get at it with troops and tanks if necessary, but not to give the people who lived there the support they needed. So it was always a place that, in a sense, he saw as trouble. And in that place, you had a lot of people who, in the course of the Arab Spring, saw an opportunity to move Libya to a better future. They created for themselves a kind of council of 23 people who, in my view, were very competent, very capable. They came from across the whole country, and they wanted to try and move the country away from Gaddafi. And he, of course, was not keen for that to happen. So he threatened a bloodbath. And as a response to that, led by President Sarkozy of France and Prime Minister Cameron of the UK, we put together, through a very long process, and I describe all this in the book, the kind of coalition to stop it, which was to strategically bomb where he was trying to move forward and prevent it from happening. I'm paraphrasing like mad. It's more complicated than this, but just to give you a sense of it. The trouble was that for many people in Libya, this seemed like the West, if you like, the coalition was coming in, the cavalry was arriving to actually try and help them make the changes they wanted. The trouble was that it was a country that we did not understand in many cases in terms of the different groupings and tribal rivalries underneath, if you like, the autocratic leader who'd held everything oppressed and suppressed. And when eventually Gaddafi was killed, many, many months later, chaos quickly ensued in Libya. And the lessons I think that we take, and as I said, there are echoes of Iraq, was the planning for what would come afterwards, the lack of understanding of exactly what might happen, the very difficult decision of whether by moving to stop something that you fear could be a bloodbath from Benghazi, you have created another set of circumstances. And whether he would ever have moved in and actually killed everybody was something we will never know. But it was a very real threat. Your point about hubris, though, is the sense that this was about two European leaders who were leading the charge, especially, I think, the President of France, without thinking about what would come afterwards. And the book is called And Then What? Because particularly over Libya, a lot of what I would be saying is, well, and then what? What do we do then? If we move and we create these circumstances, what happens next? It's a very difficult call when you're confronted with the immediacy of what you see to be the threat to life. The challenge, though, is always to be able to answer the and then what question. And the reason that you could call it hubris is that that was not on the minds of those who were leading it at that point.
Thank you.
Yes,
Hello,
you do.
Baroness. Cathy.
Kathy.
Sorry. Thank you for being here with us. It's an honor. You're an inspiration. I'm also a first-generation student. I'm a third-year student in Pardee, and I'm from Mexico. I'm studying international business, economics, and politics.
Wow.
And in your talk, you said that one of the most important things for a diplomat to be able to do is to gain people's trust. But especially in diplomacy, a lot of times there's prejudices that are built, and there's distrust. So my question is, how do you first destroy the distrust in you to later build that trust? Would you say it's helpful to differentiate yourself as an individual from the party that you're representing? Is that helpful for the other person to see past the organization that you represent, to look into you as a person? And if you do that, how do you make sure that you're still looking out for your party's best interests?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think you need to differentiate yourself from a party. I mean, I represented the European Union. I am who I am. I used to joke that when I began most conversations, I would begin by saying, hello, I'm British. Can I just apologise now? And if it wasn't the Brits, it was probably somebody else in Europe, so can I apologise for them? And I would make it as a joke because I wanted to explain not that I wasn't proud to be British, because I am, or proud to be European, because I am, but that we've also learnt a lot in the course of our own history. And you need to approach, I think, from the position of saying, this is who I am. I have a long heritage and history as this. I represent people who actually want to try and help. And they may not be, in your mind, the likeliest helpers, the people that you'd like to sit in a room with, but actually our job is to try and nonetheless help you. But I'm not distancing myself from who I am. I'm recognizing my own failings, my own history, the problems that I bring because of that, and moving beyond them. Because in any negotiation or conflict, one of the things you're really trying to do is to not forget the past and the pain that people have suffered and the horrors of it all, but to try and say, yeah, that's right. But what I'm trying to do is make sure we don't do that again, that the next generation has a better life, that we recognize and acknowledge that we mourn and weep for what has gone before, but that we go forward and that we do it with the humility of knowing our own part in it.
I saw, I think, Gideon, you were next, right?
Yeah.
Gideon.
Hi, I'm Gideon.
I can't hear you. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, I'll talk into the microphone. Okay. Hi, I'm Gideon, third-year student at Pardee, studying mostly Middle East, North Africa studies. And my original question was similar to his, actually, but sort of, you've also described a long-term effort that's needed to ensure that the and then what question is answered. Yeah, things are going to be good. How do you kind of, and that involves a lot of resources, the way you seem to be describing it, a lot of diplomatic attention. So how do you prioritize which issues get that level of attention with the finite amount of resources any foreign service has? How do you do that sort of triage?
It's a really, really good
Thank you.
question. Thank you, Gideon, for that. You're always in the business, anyone in public policy and public life, just like anyone running a household or their own budget, is constantly looking at prioritizing and trying to move your priorities around to tackle individual problems, whether it's paying the rent or it's sorting out the kids' shoes or it's dealing with the number of international crises that we all face. I always say to governments, though, that if you don't look at the crises that you're trying to solve, they'll come and get you anyway. You know, that a lot of problems that we face now are problems because we didn't sort something out earlier. Climate change is the most obvious one. The storm that you didn't get in Boston, but I thought you might, may be a result of that. What's happening in the polar ice cap certainly is a result of that. That the dramatic changes in where people can live is certainly that. So you reap the whirlwind of what you don't solve. And that's true when you look especially at issues of migration, where people are on the move because they can no longer live where they lived for centuries. They're living in flooded areas in Pakistan that after 300 years villages are impossible to live in, or they're looking at famine and drought in other parts of Africa. 75% of people on the move are in Africa. They're not coming to the shores of Europe. They're mainly in Africa. If you look at the population movements, quite extraordinary movements going on. And integrating people into new societies or giving them opportunities or trying to solve the problems requires you to tackle the problems that are faced now. So in the context of scarce resources, it's also about saying, if we don't deal with this now, it will cost us 1,000 times more in a few years' time, simply because we will be dealing with the consequences of the failure of our action. So it's a sort of invest to save, dealing with crises before they get there, or dealing with them properly when they do arise.
Hello.
Hello?
Kathy.
Yes. Hey.
So my name is Michael. I'm studying international affairs, and what stood out in your wonderful presentation was that you pointed out diplomats should see what your either rivals or your the person that you're having conversations, what they see and how they view things. In my humble opinion, is that when a Western country faces China, for example, the Chinese would drag themselves automatically into the year of 1840, 1860, 1888, how the Westerns bullied China, like British bullied China in the Opium Wars, and how the British and French burned down their old summer palace. And then I still remember that in the clashing conversation between the U.S., the meeting between U.S. and China in Alaska, China's delegate said, "Haven't we Chinese suffered enough from you Westerners?" I assumed that Mr. Blinken was more perplexed than angered after hearing that. But it's just something that the Chinese would think automatically when they see foreign rivals. And not just the government, also like the domestic audience. They think that you have always been thinking about how to push or kick their contemporary governments out of the office rather than nudging them to democracy. Rather, you just want them gone. And that's how China's are seeing these Western countries were developed world as a rival rather than a friend. Even though the U.S. helped China to get into WTO, but they think you owed us. And then your first intention was to, you said that maybe when Chinese the living standard has improved, they will give up this autocracy or this sort of socialist ideas. And so they would think, your intention was to remove us from the office rather than helping us. So I think that's a lot of Western diplomats or Western countries not seeing what the Chinese see things. Rather, they just think, you are autocracy, or you are dictatorship. You are trying to spread this idea to the world, and they think we have no history in colonization. So do you agree with my opinion that the Western diplomats are not doing enough to see how they see things and how they view the world? Thank you.
So, Michael, I think what you described is really interesting, and I want to make two comments about it. The first is that there is quite often a view that exists, not particularly in China, but in the world, that somehow what we all do is about regime change. Or it's used as an excuse to say, well, of course, all they really want to do is remove the leader, which is not necessarily the case, not often the case. And it is a challenge, I think, in the backdrop of what's happened in some recent ways in which we've engaged with the world. I mean, we didn't chase Yanukovych out of Ukraine, he left. It was the people of Libya who removed Gaddafi, but it nonetheless gets associated with our desire. But I worked very closely with China for 4.5 years on the Iran talks. They were a partner of mine. They never talked about the past. Of course I knew about what we did. I've been to the new summer palace in Beijing. And China has the potential to play, in my view, an important role in the multilateral way in which we try and resolve issues. We have many issues with China, and we will raise them. We always did. I never failed to raise them. And China would not have expected less from me. Equally, they would raise issues with me. And our purpose in meeting and talking together on the Iran deal was to find common cause. And for those of you who don't know, China was a partner that stayed with the talks from the beginning to the end. It never missed a meeting. The Chinese delegates always took part. Senior ministers came. They were prepared to talk to the Iranians in very strong terms on behalf of what was called the P5+1. So there is something that I think, as I look at the future, that we need to be able to capture a bit more in the relationship with China.
And Kate, you might need to turn it on. Yes, and then we're going to be going after this comment. If you haven't had a chance to ask a comment, I know there were hands, and I'm sorry if I didn't see everyone, but we will be having a reception afterwards, and I'm sure you're able to engage in all the rest of the questions.
Go for it.
Hi, Cathy.
Hi.
when you read the last page of the book, it was really inspiring. Like hearing your like progress when you broke the glass ceiling, and like my question deals with the like the European Union seen as a declining power. So like what happened in a recent comment in somewhere in Europe, Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar said like Europe has to grow. Like this was his quote, and I'm repeating it. Europe has to grow out of its mindset that European problem are world problem, and world problem is not European problem. So, and this quote was echoed all around the global south. And like who now see Europe as a declining power with like Brexit and stuff, and so how do you like respond to that with your background, and what's your thoughts on his like comment? And his comment is of course driven from his political affiliation in India, but still, like as a diplomat, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I've already heard his comment. He did. It was a brilliantly put together comment, I have to say, because it did echo everywhere. There's nothing like a great soundbite if you're a minister. So he gets the prize for the best soundbite. But I don't think he's correct. I think that two things that strike me. One is, if the EU was declining, why are so many countries desperate to get into it? I can think of at least 9 that would like to join tomorrow. So that's not a sense of decline. Does it sell itself as well as it might? Not at all. Does it have some internal issues to sort out? Absolutely. But fundamentally, if you pull this many countries together and get them to work together, it is astonishing as an achievement. Again, there's something I've been saying a lot, is that it is the only place in the world, Brussels is the only place in the world, where diplomats fail if they simply stick to their own country's position. You can only succeed if you've actually found a compromise. And you would see that when I was there, that you know, people would say, oh, Hungary's never going to move, or Poland's never going to move, and they always did, because they always wanted to be part of the team in the end, rather than stand apart. And my second and final comment is, I think that one of the things that we've not got right in Europe is our relationship with India. It's an amazing country. We have, in Britain, had a long history together. And of course, we have many people whose heritage is from India. And I'm very proud of that. But we've not quite worked out how to develop the relationship. And I think India often feels that it's an afterthought, or it's useful when we need it as this huge democracy, rather than that we have the strength of a relationship. I've tried to get a trade deal with India. It's not easy, let me tell you. And I tried to do work as a justice minister on trying to get them to allow lawyers to do things in courts in India. That didn't work either. But nonetheless, I think that the point he was making, the sub-point was that this relationship is not as strong as it should be.
All right, please join me in thanking Cathy.